Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Standard Bearers. What is legalism? Spare the rod and spoil the child. This heartless bit of parenting advice has thankfully gone out of date, as we've realized that physical violence towards children is both morally objectionable and ineffective as a way to instill good behavior. But few parents believe that they can get by without ever disciplining their children, even if this now means the naughty step or the time out, rather than a thorough spanking. The psychological insight here is not particularly subtle. If you want a child to stop doing something, then punish them for doing it. If you want them to do something again, reward them for doing it. It's a technique with application well beyond child rearing, of course. We send criminals to jail and hand out promotions to those who perform well at work. Indeed, you might say that society as a whole will run well just so long as the right regime of reward and punishment is in place. Well, you might not say that, but some classical political thinkers did, namely those usually grouped under the heading of legalism, an approach whose most well-known exponent is Han Fei. This is due to the importance of the text that bears his name, the Han Feizi, even though the question of Han Fei's authorship is at best unclear. In the Han Feizi, it is said that the ruler should administer rigorous punishments to his own population to keep them in line. They will not appreciate this or even understand the need for it, but that's because they are indeed like children who protest when being forced to undergo medical treatment. The basic message here is, leave it to us, we know better than you know yourself what's best for you. Han Fei was a savvy political advisor who had the chance to put his ideas into practice, according to Sima Qian in the Xiji, or Records of the Historian, which we've encountered a few times in previous episodes. We need to bear in mind, however, that the Xiji exercises a fair bit of poetic license, not least in how it presents certain figures in Chinese history. In any case, here is its account of Han Fei. Born into a small state with little power, he supposedly studied with the major Confucian philosopher Xunzi. We'll come back to that in due course. After building a reputation as an expert on political methods, Han Fei served as a minister to the rising power of Xin. Here he was put to death in 233 BCE, thanks to scheming from a fellow student of Xunzi's named Li Ci. In addition to its rather patchy account of Han Fei's life, the Xiji takes a fairly dim view of Han Fei and the other thinkers associated with his approach. It says, they do not distinguish between kin and stranger, or differentiate between noble and base. All are judged as one, according to their standards. So they undermine the kindnesses of treating one's kin as kin, and honoring the honorable. It is a policy that could be practiced for a time, but not applied for long. So I say, they are strict and have little kindness. The Shizi's reference to Han Fei and his associates having little kindness arises, at least in part, because of the association between Han Fei's thought and the state of Xin, which finally managed to unify all under heaven as a single empire, bringing the Warring States period to a close. It helps to remind ourselves that the Shizi was written during the Han period, which followed the Qin, and was therefore critical about the perceived failures of Xin rule. The sole domination of the Xin began in 221 BCE, but lasted for only a few years. The rule of Xin ended in 206 BCE, to be replaced by the much longer-lived Han dynasty. The Qin thus serves as a transition, even if a very troubled one, from the chaotic time of the Warring States to the period of unification under the Han. Similarly, the ideas of Han Fei and his associates will provide us with a useful transition from philosophy during the Warring States period to philosophy under the Han. The association between legalist ideas and the Qin dynasty is especially informative because the Qin rulers seem to have put into practice the harsh measures recommended by texts like the Han Feizi. But as usual, there are caveats to consider. As we'll be seeing in this and later episodes, Han Fei's ideas were both anticipated by earlier thinkers and continue to have significant influence under the Han. So we should not see his school of thought simply as the house doctrine of the Qin Empire. Then too, it is, again, as usual, not so straightforward to treat legalism as a school of thought. When introducing the assessment we just quoted, Sima Qian speaks of the Fajia, meaning the group or school of Fa. This name was coined by his father, Sima Tan, in a presentation of the 6 schools of warring states thought. In English, Fajia is usually translated as legalism, on the grounds that Fa can mean penal law, and that Han Feizi and the other so-called legalists do have a fair amount to say about that. But these thinkers did not see themselves as card-carrying members of a tradition called Fajia, as is obvious from the fact that Sima Tan invented the term later. In this sense, legalism is not unlike Taoism, a retrospective category applied to various thinkers who have a kind of family resemblance to one another. But there's another, more convincing reason to treat the term legalism with some caution. Fa does not only mean law. In that quotation from Sima Qian, we rendered it as standards, which reflects the most general sense of Fa in warring states philosophy. But we should also bear in mind that these legalist thinkers often use the word with a dual meaning. For them, the Fa, or standard, is what is maintained through a set of laws, based on rewarding certain behaviors and punishing others, also referred to as Fa. A prime example would be the aforementioned regime of reward and punishment so important to Han Fei and other so-called legalists like Shang Buhai. He encouraged the meting out of rewards and punishments depending on how each official has carried out their assigned duties. He called this practice Xingming because it involves measuring Xing, performance, relative to Ming, official title. This is an example of Fa because it is an application of standards, propped up in this case by a system of rewards and punishments. In light of this, it would be more appropriate to speak of Fa thinkers, which reflects both senses of Fa, than legalists, though we will not entirely avoid the latter term simply because of its familiarity. So who were these Fa thinkers, apart from Han Fei? Well, we've just mentioned Shang Buhai, who died in 337 BCE, so more than a century before the ascendance of the Qin dynasty. He was a minister in the same minor state where Han Fei would be born, namely Han, not to be confused with the Han of the dynasty that would later replace the Qin. Unfortunately, Shang Buhai's works are lost apart from a few fragments. The same goes for the similarly named Shang Dao, whom Xunzi belittled as a thinker preoccupied with standards, yet lacking in standards himself. Shang Dao anticipates much of what we find in the Han Feizi, including the trust placed in standards as a way of running society. Thus we find him saying that what is imposed by standards is thus that each receives his reward or penalty in the proportion due to him, and none has expectations from the ruler. Therefore, resentment does not arise, and the relationship between the above and below is harmonious. In Shang Dao's opinion, it is better to have even bad standards than no standards at all. He also makes the important point that standards are man-made, not sent down by heaven. This gives us a contrast between the Fa tradition and Moism, which we also saw prominently invoking standards. Unlike Mozi, Shang Dao sees standards not as modeled on divine qualities or practices, but as an instrument used by human rulers to keep unruly populations in check. The two Shuns, Shang Dao and Shang Buhai, were thus important forerunners of Han Fei. But given that their texts have not survived in anything like complete versions, they occupy a more minor role in our story than another earlier thinker named Shang Yang, also known by his original name Gongsun Yang. His life story is remarkably similar to that of Han Fei. He too was from a minor state, in this case the state of Wei, where he rose to be a high official. When he was passed over for the position of prime minister, he offered his talents to another regime. Yes, you guessed it, this was the state of Qin, where he served the ruler Xiao, who reigned from 361 to 338 BCE. Here he brought in decisive reforms, all of which bear the legalist hallmark. For example, he divided the population into small groups and made each person responsible for anything done by any member of the group, according to penal law. This would motivate people to put pressure on each other to behave well, or if you want to be less charitable, encourage them to inform on each other. He also oversaw a reform of land distribution and of the system of weights and measures. This last detail sounds almost too good to be true, as a policy coming from a proponent of standards. But it does seem that Shang Yang was genuinely responsible for this, and other reforms introduced in Qin during his time. It would also have been appropriate if he had been rewarded and not punished for his achievements, and this is what happened at first, as he was granted extensive landholdings. But Xiao's successor, Hui Wen, had Shang Yang put to death, possibly because he was worried that this minister had taken too much power into his own hands. Having lived by the sword, he now died by the sword, or rather by being pulled into pieces by chariots, and it is recorded that the people were not unhappy to see him go. Shang Yang would be the last person to ask for reward beyond his merit, so he would approve of our mentioning that not all the writings that come down to us under his name are authentic. Nearly the whole text does seem to have been written before the rise of the Qin dynasty, but historical events are mentioned in it that happened after Shang Yang's lifetime. Still, the collection of writings has a good deal of intellectual coherence and can be taken to represent the ideas of this highly effective minister and of others who took inspiration from him. A good summary of these ideas may be found in the 6th chapter. When the superior man holds authority, he establishes techniques of rule by rectifying everything. He establishes offices and makes rank esteemed so as to correspond to office. He investigates one's labor, elevates the meritorious, and then makes the appointments. Then superior and inferior are balanced. When superior and inferior are balanced, ministers are able to fully commit their strength, and the sovereign is able to monopolize the handles of authority. The end of this passage prefigures Han Fei's talk of reward and punishment as the two handles by which the ruler manipulates society. In the same spirit, Shang Yang advises the ruler to use punishments to handle cowards. They will surely become brave. And use rewards to handle the brave. They will be ready to die. Disturbingly, he also recommends punishing likely misdeeds ahead of time to make sure they are never committed. Evidently, Shang Yang was not one for sparing the rod. He would no doubt have enjoyed a story told with approval by Han Fei. A ruler got drunk, and the ceremonial keeper of the hat covered him with a robe. When the ruler woke up, he punished both this man and the keeper of the robe, the latter because he had failed to do his job, and the keeper of the hat for overstepping his bounds. Han Fei adds, "It was not that the ruler did not dislike the cold, but that he considered the trespass of one official upon the duties of another to be a greater danger than cold." It should be increasingly clear why these thinkers have a reputation for severity. But remember, Shang Yang and Han Fei were no less in favor of reward than punishments. Furthermore, they endorsed these measures as a way to achieve their ultimate goal, which was a flourishing state. Indeed, Shang Yang states at the outset of his book that the purpose of Fa is to care for the people. Even when it comes to punishment, there is little or no hint of sadism in these texts. To the contrary, Shang Yang expresses distaste for cruelty, saying that we use corporal punishments only because they are so effective in discouraging misbehavior. This means that there will be no need for further sanctions, so that clear punishments eliminate executions. Or as he puts it elsewhere, the ideal ruler relies on punishments to eradicate punishments. This is why sometimes legalist Fa is understood as referring specifically to penal law. Shang Yang also justifies these measures as a response to unusually testing times. He constructs a history according to which the early people lived simple lives, staying within close-knit family relationships. As time went by and the population increased, there was ever more need for hierarchy, and the people came to rejoice in benevolence within the relations between superior and inferior. Now, with more people than ever before, ministers and officials have come to the fore because they are needed to oversee a complex society. As a result, whereas people used to be virtuous in former times, they are now deceitful and cunning. They seek to evade control by their superiors, even if those superiors are doing what they should, namely trying to make the country rich and the army strong. People are self-interested and desire to avoid the labors of agriculture and the dangers of war. So success depends on motivating them to farm and to fight. This situation calls for an entirely different set of standards than the ones used by successful rulers of antiquity. It is by relying on standards, above all the regime of reward and punishment, that a ruler can suppress the counterproductive desires of his subjects. though Shang compares this process of manipulating the people to the way a potter molds clay, he seems to take human self-interest as both given and unchangeable. Rather than trying to make the people better, or invoking high-flown concepts of morality, benevolence, and the like, one should take people as they are and instrumentalize their desires and preferences. Han Fei agrees and speaks of clipping the wings of the people to prevent them from enjoying the freedom they will inevitably use to act against the ruler's interests. He's even more cynical when it comes to the ministers and officials who are meant to serve the ruler, but who are in fact almost always self-serving. Since lower-ranked people lack power, they naturally turn to deceit to get what they want. A whole chapter of the Han Feizi is devoted to the 8 villainies used by scheming officials against which the ruler must constantly be on guard. Since it is impossible to micromanage the official's every task, the only solution is the use of fa. In this case, fa means holding each official to the standards of their office, much as Shen Buhai explained with his concept of Xingming, and as Shen Dao conveyed with his emphasis on the consistent application of rules. To show mercy is to undermine the fa system. Han Fei thus says of rulers who weep out of pity when administering severe punishments, "This is a fine display of benevolence, but contributes nothing to the achievement of order." As this suggests, Han Fei and the other Fa thinkers have a conception of ideal rule that is far removed from what the Confucians recommended. This is something we'll discuss further in a later episode, the contrast between the personalized, charismatic leadership of a moral paragon who responds to each situation individually, and an impersonal, detached style of rule that calls for the unrelenting implementation of standards. If that opposition to the Confucians is expected, more surprising is the way that Han Fei's ideas bring him rather close to what we found in the Taoists. In fact, our historian, Sima Qian, discusses Han Fei in a chapter together with Lao Tzu, suggesting that he saw the two as closely connected. And the Han Fei itself makes the connection very explicit by including 2 sections that comment on parts of the Lao Tzu. In other parts of the work, too, we find passages that resonate strongly with Taoism, or could even have come straight from a Taoist work, like this one: "The way is the beginning of all beings and the measure of right and wrong, while the ruler waits, empty and still." Han Fei also advises, "Do not let your power be seen, be blank and actionless." As this suggests, the use of standards amounts to a kind of wu wei, or non-action, because there is nothing more to ruling than letting the rules do their work. When we looked at the concept of wu wei back in episode 38, we considered the possibility that philosophers developed the idea of non-action in part as a way to discourage incompetent rulers from making mistakes. In the Han Feizi, this possibility comes out into the open. It officially states that its recommendations are aimed, if not at outright incompetent rulers, then at those who are neither especially good nor especially bad. Where the Confucians hoped that wise ministers and advisors could offset the shortcomings of such rulers, Han Fei thinks it is better to trust in good standards and laws. Indeed, theoretically at least, the ruler himself should be subject to these standards and laws. A story about Shang makes this point. When a royal prince misbehaves, he punishes the prince's tutors, saying, "If the laws are not implemented, it is because they are violated from the top," though one cannot help noticing that the prince himself is not punished. One also can't help noticing a tension within the Fa thinker's way of describing the implementation of laws and standards. On the one hand, these need to be adapted to changing circumstances, a task that could only be carried out by wise rulers or ministers. On the other hand, the standards need to be predictable and stable, and the rulers are assumed to be mediocre and the ministers are corrupt. Compounding this difficulty, the Han Feizi occasionally seems to adopt the perspective of the officials rather than of the ruler, and even to recommend accepting advice from honest ministers, despite mostly depicting officials of all levels as duplicitous schemers who will take a mile if offered an inch. Yuri Pines, a leading specialist of legalism, has speculated that the talk of wu wei and emphasis on impersonal law is in fact designed to keep the ruler out of politics. This would clear the way for real power to be wielded by ministers, men like Shang and Han Fei themselves. It would be a fine irony if the Han Feizi itself turned out to be an example of ministerial deceit and misdirection, It's a work that cautions rulers to avoid betraying their likes and dislikes, since ministers could exploit knowledge of these for the sake of manipulation. Perhaps Han Fei knew that rulers dislike remaining inactive and just following rules, and so cunningly devised a text that could persuade them to do so nonetheless. But even if we don't go quite that far and see the entire Han Feizi as deliberately deceptive, we can hardly doubt that it is a bracingly amoral and pragmatic work, one that prioritizes the effective over the ethical. Having said that, Han Fei and the other Fa thinkers had at least to reckon with the moral beliefs and presuppositions of the people who are subjected to their standards. To be too savage with punishments, or too openly dismissive of ethical considerations, could itself endanger a regime, if not win it lasting disrepute, which, according to many observers, is exactly what happened with the Qin dynasty. Is this reputation deserved, and does the story of the Qin display the limitations of legalist thought? Join us next time as we find out, by asking just how far the long arm of the law could reach, here on the History of Philosophy in China.